All right, welcome back to the deep dive. I think it's safe to say our listeners, being the philosophy enthusiasts they are, really enjoy a good, thought-provoking topic. And today, well, we're diving into a particularly fascinating area of epistemology. We're going to be talking about epistemic contextualism.
Yeah, it's a topic that's generated a lot of discussion and debate in contemporary epistemology, that's for sure. It really gets to the heart of some fundamental questions about how we understand and attribute knowledge.
Exactly.
That's
So,
it.
in a nutshell, epistemic contextualism, or EC as we'll probably call it for short, argues that the truth of a statement like S knows that P depends in part on the context of the person who's making that statement. So, for example, if I say the library opens at 9 a.m., that might be perfectly true in my current context, given the standards of knowledge that apply here. But another philosopher, maybe someone considering a different set of possibilities, might legitimately deny that I know this.
Right, and that's what makes it distinct from invariantism, which is kind of the more traditional view in epistemology. Invariantists would say that the truth conditions for knowledge attributions are fixed. They don't change depending on who's doing the attributing or their specific circumstances.
Got it. So the standards for knowing are constant objective. That's the invariantist view.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what we're going to try to do today is unpack this whole EC framework. What are the philosophical motivations behind it? What are the arguments that support it? And what are some of the main criticisms that have been leveled against it?
Right.
Because ultimately, we want to see how EC aligns with or challenges our philosophical intuitions about what knowledge is and how we attribute it. Does it make sense? Does it create more problems than it solves?
Yeah, exactly. And the goal is to, I think, give our listeners a new perspective on how they think about and talk about knowledge, both in everyday life and in those really complex philosophical discussions.
Right. Because let's face it, we use the word know all the time, but do we really stop to think about what we mean by it?
Right, exactly.
Okay, so for this deep dive, we're mainly drawing from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on epistemic contextualism, which is a great resource for this topic. It lays out the history, the arguments, and the different perspectives really well.
Yes, it's an excellent resource for anyone who wants to delve into the intricacies of this debate.
Okay, so let's start with a bit of history.
Mm.
Where did this idea of EC come from? It's not like it's one of the classic philosophical debates, right?
It's relatively recent, actually. It started gaining traction in the latter half of the 20th century.
Okay, so pretty recent in the grand scheme of philosophy.
Exactly. But, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. It emerged from a bunch of different trends in philosophy that were kind of shifting the focus towards the role of context in epistemology.
Okay, so what were some of those trends, those precursor ideas?
Well, one of the big ones was this idea that maybe there isn't just one single concept of knowledge. Maybe the word know has different senses. A stronger, more philosophical sense, and then a weaker, more everyday sense.
So, like, what counts as knowing in a casual conversation might not cut it in a philosophical debate.
Exactly. And philosophers like Malcolm and Wittgenstein, they kind of touched on this idea early on. And then later, people like Castaneda and Stein, they were looking at specific cases and arguing that, hey, it seems like the criteria for knowledge actually change depending on the context.
So the idea that know isn't this monolithic thing. It kind of adapts to different situations.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so that's one trend. What else was going on?
Another big one was the development of relevant alternatives theories of knowledge, or RA theories. These philosophers, like Dretske and Goldman, they were arguing that for someone to know something, they don't need to rule out every single possibility that could make it false. They only need to rule out the relevant ones.
Okay, so not every conceivable doubt, just the ones that matter in that specific context.
Exactly. And of course, what counts as a relevant alternative, well, that can change depending on the situation you're in. Like, usually we don't worry about the possibility of being a brain in a vat in our everyday lives.
Right.
That's not a relevant alternative in most contexts.
Right. So certain doubts just don't even come into play unless the context makes them relevant.
Right. And this was seen as a way to deal with skepticism, those arguments that say we can't really know anything for sure. The RA theorists were saying, well, yeah, maybe we can't rule out every single doubt, but we can rule out the relevant ones, and that's enough for knowledge in most cases.
Okay, that's interesting. So relevant alternatives depend on the context.
Yeah. And then another trend was the growing emphasis on the social aspects of knowledge and justification. Philosophers like Rorty and Annis were pointing out that things like justification, they're not just about an individual and their beliefs. They also depend on the social context, like who's raising doubts and what those doubts are.
So, like, the level of justification I need to have might change depending on who I'm talking to. If I'm just chatting with a friend, it's different from if I'm defending my thesis in front of a panel of experts.
Exactly. The demands of the situation, the social expectations, they all play a role.
Okay, so that's another piece of the puzzle.
And even in the discussions about Gettier cases, those classic examples where someone has a justified true belief, but it doesn't seem like they really know, well, people like John Pollock were suggesting that maybe social expectations about what a knower should be aware of, those also play a role in our judgments about knowledge.
So it's not just about the individual's internal state of justification, but also about how their beliefs align with what's expected in that particular social context.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've got these different trends. The idea of multiple senses of no, the context dependence of relevant alternatives, the social aspects of justification. How did all of these come together to form this unified framework of epistemic contextualism?
Well, all of these were pointing to the importance of context in our understanding of knowledge. They were highlighting things that traditional epistemology hadn't really paid enough attention to. And eventually, these ideas started to coalesce into a more systematic view, which is what we now call epistemic contextualism.
Okay, so context is key.
Yeah. But before we go any further, it's important to distinguish between two main types of contextualism that the SEP-M entry talks about: substantive contextualism and semantic contextualism.
Okay, so two flavors of contextualism.
Right. Substantive contextualism is about the nature of knowledge or justification itself. It says that these are inherently contextual. They don't exist in some kind of absolute context-independent way. Michael Williams, for instance, he's argued for this kind of view.
Okay, so knowledge itself is relative to the context.
Yeah, but semantic contextualism, that's the one we're focusing on today. It focuses on the meaning of sentences that use the word know. It's also known as attributor contextualism.
Attributor contextualism. So it's not about knowledge itself changing, it's about the meaning of our knowledge claims changing, depending on the context.
Exactly. And semantic EC, it's basically saying that sentences with no in them, they don't express a complete proposition until you specify the context.
Okay, so the context fills in the missing pieces of meaning.
Right. It's kind of like how sentences like "it's raining" or "I'm hungry," those are obviously context sensitive. If I say "it's raining," you need to know where I am to know what I'm talking about. Same with "I'm hungry." It matters who's saying it. And EC is saying that "no" works in a similar way. The context of the speaker determines the standards that need to be met for a knowledge attribution to be true.
So like if I say my friend knows how to bake a cake, the standards for knowing how to bake a cake are going to be different from the standards a professional baker would use, right?
Exactly. And EC is all about how those standards shift depending on the context of the person making the knowledge claim.
Okay, so it's not about knowledge itself being relative. It's about the way we talk about knowledge being relative to the context.
Right, and the SP is very clear about that. It's a thesis about the semantics of sentences with no, not a theory about the underlying nature of knowledge itself.
Okay, so it's like how the word I refers to a different person depending on who's speaking, but that doesn't mean our concept of personal identity is relative.
Right, it's a good analogy.
Okay, so this idea of context sensitivity, it's not exactly obvious at first glance, is it? I mean, it kind of goes against our initial intuitions about knowledge.
Yeah, it does take a bit of philosophical reflection to really wrap your head around it.
So what are the arguments that proponents of EC use to convince us that this is the right way to think about knowledge?
Well, one of their main strategies is to show how EC can help us resolve some of the apparent inconsistencies we see in knowledge claims, both in those really tricky philosophical scenarios like skepticism and in more everyday situations.
Okay, so let's start with the big one, skepticism. How does EC address those arguments that seem to undermine the possibility of knowledge altogether?
Right, so the SC talks about the standard skeptical argument, which goes something like this. I don't know that I'm not being deceived by an evil demon, or, these days we might say, I don't know that I'm not a brain in a vat. Then the argument continues. If I don't know that I'm not in this radically deceptive scenario, then I don't know that I have hands. So the conclusion is, I don't know that I have hands.
Right, and this argument, it has this kind of logical force to it. The premises seem plausible, the conclusion is obviously crazy, But the reasoning seems valid. It's a real philosophical puzzle.
Exactly. And it creates this tension because we intuitively feel like we do know things about the world, like that we have hands. But the skeptical argument seems to show that we can't really be sure.
Right. So how do contextualists deal with this? Do they try to show that the argument is invalid or that the premises are false?
Not usually. Most contextualists, they accept that the argument is valid and that the premises are at least plausible. Instead, they try to show that the skeptical conclusion, even if it's true in a certain sense, it doesn't actually undermine our ordinary knowledge claims.
Okay, so how do they do that?
Well, remember that EC says the meaning of no changes depending on the context. So the contextualist argues that when you're engaged in a skeptical argument, when you're considering those radical possibilities of deception, you're actually raising the standards for what it takes to know something.
So in a skeptical context, no has a much higher bar.
Exactly. So in that context, the conclusion of the skeptical argument, I don't know that I have hands, might actually be true, but that doesn't mean that our everyday claims to know we have hands are false. It just means that we're using a different standard for know in those everyday contexts.
So the skeptic and the ordinary person, they're kind of talking past each other because they're using the word no in different ways.
Right. The skeptic is using a really high standard, one that's almost impossible to meet. But in everyday life, we use a lower, more practical standard. And EC allows for both of these to be true at the same time.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not that skepticism is wrong. It's just that it's talking about a different kind of knowledge, one
Yeah.
that's not really relevant to most of our lives.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. And to explain why we might get confused and think that skepticism is a threat to our everyday knowledge, contextualists often appeal to what they call an error theory.
An error theory.
Yeah, the idea is that we, as speakers of the language, we're not always fully aware of how context-sensitive the word no is. So we mistakenly think that the skeptic is using the same standard for no that we use in everyday life. And that leads us to think that skepticism is a problem for all knowledge.
This is like a blind spot in our understanding of language.
Right. And the SEPI entry goes on to describe a bunch of different versions of EC and how they apply this general strategy to skepticism.
Okay, so different flavors of EC, each with its own twist on how context matters for knowledge.
Exactly. Like Keith DeRose, he focuses on the sensitivity of belief. He says that to know something, your belief in it has to be sensitive, meaning that if it were false, you wouldn't believe it.
So like, if I believe the library opens at 9 a.m., but I would still believe that even if it didn't, then I don't really know.
Right. And DeRose argues that in skeptical scenarios, like the brain in a vat scenario, our beliefs about the external world, they're not really sensitive, because even if we were brains in vats, we might still have the same beliefs. So according to his view, we don't know those things in a skeptical context.
Okay, so our beliefs have to be responsive to the possibility of being wrong?
Right. And then Mark Heller, he's got a more externalist view. He focuses on the reliability of our belief-forming processes. He says that the level of reliability required for knowledge depends on the context. So in a skeptical context, the standards for reliability are really high because you have to be able to rule out those crazy skeptical possibilities.
So, like, if I base my belief that the library opens at 9 a.m. on a random guess, that might be reliable enough in some contexts, but not in a context where I'm being super careful and skeptical.
Exactly. And then Stuart Cohen, he's got an internalist version of EC. He focuses on justification and says that what counts as enough justification for knowledge depends on which possibilities of error are salient, which ones are kind of at the forefront of our attention.
So, like, if someone brings up the possibility of a typo in the library schedule, suddenly my justification for believing it opens at 9 a.m. might not be good enough anymore.
Right. Because now that possibility of error is salient, it's something we have to take into account.
Okay, so context determines which possibilities of error we have to consider, and that affects our justification.
Exactly. And David Lewis, he's got a similar view. He says that you know something if it's true in all the possibilities that you haven't ruled out based on your evidence. But the key is that the range of possibilities you have to consider, that's also determined by the context.
So, like, in everyday life, we can ignore certain far-fetched possibilities. But in a philosophical discussion, those possibilities might become relevant.
Right. And for Lewis, the context of a philosophical discussion actually forces us to consider more possibilities, which means we end up knowing less. He calls this the elusiveness of knowledge.
Interesting. So philosophy itself makes knowledge harder to attain.
Yeah, in a way. And then there are other versions of EC, like Michael Bloom Tillman's view, which refines Lewis's account by focusing on pragmatic presuppositions, the shared background assumptions that underlie our conversations. And there are others too, each with their own specific mechanisms for how context affects knowledge.
Okay, so a lot of different ways to cash out this idea of context sensitivity.
Yeah, but the common thread is that the standards for knowledge change depending on the context, and that's how they try to deal with skepticism.
Okay, so that's how EC tackles those big philosophical challenges. But they also appeal to everyday examples to show how context matters for knowledge, right?
Right. They say that we see this context sensitivity all the time in how we talk about knowledge in ordinary
Okay,
situations.
so what are some of those everyday examples?
Well, the SEP talks about this famous example from Stuart Cohen, the airport example. It goes like this. Mary and John, they're at the airport and they really need to make their connecting flight because they have this important business meeting. And they hear this guy, Smith, say that he knows their flight stops in Chicago because he saw it on his itinerary.
Okay, so Smith is pretty confident about the flight.
Yeah, but Mary and John, they're super stressed about missing their connection. So they start questioning whether Smith really knows. They bring up possibilities like maybe there's a printing error on the itinerary or maybe the schedule changed.
So they're not willing to just take Smith's word for it.
Right, because the stakes are high for them. They can't afford to be wrong.
Right, so their context makes them more demanding about what counts as knowledge.
Exactly. And the contextualist interpretation of this is that the high stakes for Mary and John, they raise the standards for knowing. So even if Smith's claim was true in his context where the stakes were lower, it's not true in Mary and John's context.
Okay, so Smith might know in a casual sense, but he doesn't know in a sense that's relevant to Mary and John's situation.
Right. And the contextualist argues that this is why their skepticism seems reasonable. If knowledge were an absolute thing, then it would be weird for Mary and John to doubt Smith, even if they were worried about being wrong.
Right, it would be like saying, well, Smith knows, but we still need to double check just in case.
Hmm.
That doesn't make much sense if knowing is all or nothing.
Exactly. So contextualism explains this kind of everyday skepticism by saying that the meaning of no changes depending on the context, just like in the skeptical argument.
Okay, so context matters, both for the big philosophical stuff and for our everyday conversations about knowledge.
Right. And the SEPI also mentions how EC has been applied to other philosophical puzzles, like the lottery paradox and Gettier cases, although those applications are a bit more controversial.
So EC is a pretty versatile tool, even if not everyone agrees on how to use it.
Yeah. And another issue that comes up is the closure principle for knowledge.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that if you know something and you know that it implies something else, then you also know that other thing.
Right, like if I know that all bachelors are unmarried, and I know that John is a bachelor, then I know that John is unmarried.
Exactly. And most contextualists, they think that closure does hold, but only within a particular context. So if you know those things within a certain set of standards, then closure applies. But if the standards change, then closure might not hold across different contexts.
Okay, so closure is context dependent too.
Right.
Okay, so EC, it seems to offer some interesting solutions to some classic philosophical problems, but it also faces some criticisms, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of objections that have been raised against EC.
Okay, so what are some of the main criticisms?
Well, one of the early ones came from Fred Drutzky. He was worried that if EC is true, then skeptics could just make our ordinary knowledge claims false by raising the standards for knowledge.
So, like, if a skeptic comes along and starts talking about brains and vats,
Yeah.
suddenly I don't know anything anymore.
Right, that was his concern. But contextualists, they respond to this by saying that, yes, the skeptic might be able to raise the standards in their own context, but that doesn't change the truth of our everyday knowledge claims in our own contexts.
So the skeptic is kind of changing the rules of the game, but that doesn't mean we were playing the game wrong before.
Exactly. Another criticism has to do with what are called bizarre dialogues. The HESEP gives an example of a conversation about a zebra, where someone first says they know it's a zebra, then someone mentions the possibility of it being a cleverly disguised mule, and then the first person says they don't know anymore.
Yeah, that does sound a bit strange. It's like, I knew it a minute ago, but now I don't.
Right. And this kind of back and forth, it seems to be allowed by some versions of EC, which is a problem because it doesn't really fit with how we talk about knowledge in real life.
Right, knowledge should be a bit more stable than that.
Yeah. And contextualists have responded to this in a couple of ways. Some of them say that their versions of EC don't actually allow for these kinds of bizarre dialogues. They might say that once a relevant alternative, like the disguised mule is introduced, the person genuinely doesn't know anymore, even by the lower standards they were using before.
So the new information changes what they know.
Right. And others might say that in these kinds of situations, people are actually making metalinguistic claims. They're talking about how the meaning of know has changed, not about whether they actually know something in the world.
So instead of saying, I don't know anymore, they might say something like, my earlier claim to know was true given the standards we were using then, but now the standards have changed.
Exactly. But even that sounds a bit unnatural in ordinary conversation.
Yeah, it's not exactly something you hear people saying all the time.
Right. And that leads to another criticism, which is that EC allows for these weird statements where someone can say, I knew it before, but now I don't know it, just because the context has changed.
So knowledge becomes this fleeting thing that can appear and disappear depending on the conversational whims of the people involved.
Yeah, that's the concern. And contextualists respond to this by saying that, again, it's our fault for not being fully aware of how context-sensitive no is. We're just not used to thinking about it that way.
Okay, but then the question becomes, why are we so blind to this context sensitivity? If it's such a fundamental part of how no works, shouldn't we be more aware of it?
Right, that's a challenge for EC. And the SE points out that in other cases where there's context sensitivity, like with the word flat, once we realize that the different parties are using different standards, the disagreement usually goes away. But that doesn't always happen with no. People often still feel like there's a genuine disagreement about whether someone knows something, even after they realize that the context has changed.
So the context sensitivity of no is somehow harder to grasp than other kinds of context sensitivity.
Yeah, it seems that way. And then there's the whole debate about whether EC actually solves the problem of skepticism.
Right, because even if EC explains why the skeptic and the ordinary person aren't contradicting each other, it doesn't necessarily show that the ordinary person is right.
Exactly. And some critics, like Feldman and Cohn, they argue that EC doesn't guarantee that our ordinary knowledge claims are true. It just says that the standards for knowledge can change. But it doesn't tell us whether we meet those standards in our everyday lives.
So EC might give us a way out of the skeptical argument, but it doesn't necessarily give us a way to justify our beliefs.
Right. And other critics, like Kornbluth and Feldman again, they say that EC mischaracterizes what the skeptic is doing. They say that the skeptic isn't just raising the standards for knowledge, they're actually challenging the adequacy of our evidence, even by ordinary standards.
So the skeptic is saying that our reasons for believing things are just not good enough, no matter what the context is.
Right. And Sosa, he's got a different kind of criticism. He says that EC is too focused on the semantics of know, on how we use the word. He thinks that the real philosophical question is whether we actually know anything. And EC doesn't really answer that question.
So he's saying that EC is a bit of a distraction from the real issue.
Yeah, that's his view. And then there's the whole issue of EC's error theory, the claim that we're systematically mistaken about how no works.
Right, that we're blind to its context sensitivity.
Yeah. And some critics, like Schiffer, they find this really implausible. They say that it's hard to believe that we could be so wrong about a word that we use all the time.
It's like we're constantly tripping over our own language without realizing it.
Right. And contextualists have tried to defend the error theory by drawing analogies to other cases where we seem to be blind to context sensitivity, like with the word flat. But the ESET points out that those analogies aren't perfect, and it's still not clear why the context sensitivity of no would be so hidden from us.
So the error theory is a bit of a weak spot for EC.
Yeah. And then there are a bunch of linguistic issues that come up too.
Linguistic issues.
Yeah, like even though EC says that no is context sensitive, there's no agreement on exactly how it works. Some people say it's like an indexical, others say it's like a vague term, but there's no clear consensus.
So they don't have a good linguistic model for how context sensitivity works with no.
Right. And critics like Stanley, they've pointed out that no doesn't behave like other context-sensitive terms in certain ways. Like,
Yeah.
you can't really say very no or ask someone to clarify what standards they're using when they say they know something.
Right. Those kinds of things sound weird with no.
Yeah. And contextualists have tried to respond to these linguistic challenges, but it's still an area of debate.
Okay, so the linguistic details of how no works are still being worked out.
Yeah. And then the CCP goes on to talk about all these other issues that come up for EC, like its implications for epistemic modals, for how we think about knowledge sentences, for the preservation of information, for practical reasoning, and for how we interpret attitude reports.
So EC has all these ripple effects throughout philosophy.
It does. And finally, the SEPI discusses how invariantists, the people who think the meaning of no is fixed, how they deal with the same data that motivates EC.
Right, because they're not just ignoring the evidence that context seems to matter.
Yeah, they're trying to come up with their own explanations. And they've got a few main strategies. One is to focus on pragmatic factors like conversational implicatures and the practical consequences of being wrong. They say that these can explain why we might deny knowledge in certain situations, even if the person technically knows.
So it's not that the standards for knowledge have changed, it's just that the context makes it risky or inappropriate to say that someone knows.
Right. Another strategy is to focus on psychological factors, like the attributor's own level of confidence or their expectations about evidence-seeking behavior. They say that these can also explain why we might deny knowledge, even if the person's justification is objectively good enough.
So it's about the psychology of the person making the judgment, not about the meaning of no itself.
Exactly. And then the third strategy is to focus on salience and focusing effects. They say that when we focus on certain possibilities of error, that can make us think that someone doesn't know, even if their evidence is actually good enough.
So it's like a cognitive bias that makes us overestimate the possibility of error.
Right. And invariantists argue that these pragmatic, psychological, and attentional factors, they can account for all the data that motivates EC without needing to say that no is context sensitive.
Okay, so there's a real debate here between contextualists and invariantists about how to explain the evidence.
Yeah, and the SP goes on to talk about some further arguments for EC, like arguments from fallibilism, from the relationship between knowledge and assertion, and from the social role of knowledge. And it also briefly mentions some other views that are similar to EC, like contrastivism and subject-sensitive invariantism.
So it's a really complex landscape with a lot of different positions and arguments.
It is, but the fundamental question is, does the meaning of no change depending on the context? And that's a question that philosophers are still debating.
Yeah, and it's a question that has implications for how we think about a lot of other things in philosophy, like skepticism, justification, evidence, and even the nature of knowledge itself.
Exactly.
So it's a topic that's worth thinking about carefully. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder. If EC is true, if the meaning of no really does change depending on the context, what does that mean for how we evaluate knowledge claims in our own lives?
That's a good question. Does it mean we should be more careful about what we claim to know? Does it mean we should be more tolerant of other people's perspectives?
Right. Because if knowledge is relative to the context, then maybe there's no single right answer to the question of who knows what.
Maybe it's all a matter of perspective.
And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's just part of what it means to be human, to live in a world where knowledge is always provisional, always subject to revision.
It's definitely something to think about.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.